My name's Lisa Marginelli. I'm with Issues in Science and Technology, which is a quarterly magazine that is a partnership between the National Academy of Sciences and Arizona State University. Today's discussion is being hosted by Issues. Welcome. I am very happy to introduce today's discussion, which is how can scientists become players in the long game of policy change? Before I introduce the speakers and the moderator, I want to say a little bit about what we're trying to do with these events. In part, we want to bring really interesting people with expertise in specialized topics to reflect on the way science, technology, policy, and society interact in the real world. And we also recognize that such a discussion requires much more than experts, but lots of other people, society, in other words, you. So we're really happy that you're here. So about half of today's event will be moderated discussion between the panelists, and the other half will be the panel engaging with your questions. So this will allow you to have the panelists engage with the questions that you think and the issues and questions that you think are important. To enter your questions, use the Q&A function. You'll see that at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves, but please use Q&A to communicate with the moderator. We will be taking those questions and submitting them to the moderator. All right. I would like to get started now. Our moderator is David Malakoff. He is the International News Editor for Science. And I will also introduce the panelists. Erica Goldman, Director of Science Policy at the Federation of American Scientists. Michael Mintram, Professor of Politics and International Relations at Monash University. Kartikeya Singh, Director for Network Leadership, Growald Climate Fund. And Arti Garg, Founder and Chair for Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally. So I'm going to turn this over to David to start the discussion. Thank you very much. We look forward to this conversation.
Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Great panelists. Our time is short today, so I'm going to pretty much jump right in because I think we want to hear more from as much from the panelists as we can. So, Kartikeya, I'm going to start by asking you a question, and the other panelists can jump in as well later. I'm curious, when did you realize that you were a policy entrepreneur? And how did you know that you had made that shift from someone observing things to somebody trying to change them or being an active player in trying to change policy? And I'm curious if there was some kind of a catalyzing event or an experience that sort of facilitated that shift.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I am still coming to terms with, the fact that one has the ability to make change happen, and what it means to be a policy entrepreneur, and explore that through the various facets. I would say that for me, it hasn't been one event necessarily. I mean, there was one when I was a younger person, but I would say that my experience what I have unknowingly done is tried to gauge the experiences of various different types of institutions that are trying to have an impact in the ecosystem, be it the private sector, be it government, be it intergovernmental organizations or civil society organizations. Just by being in the various different institutions and understanding what role they play in change making has really informed me in how change happens and the various different paths that ultimately impacts policy. I would say that one of the most important moments for me was as a youth climate activist or delegate, I would say, to a UN climate negotiations in Indonesia in 2007, where the fate of the post-Kyoto Protocol was going to be decided. What was the new treaty that was going to be in place? And as a young person, I was told by a delegate that youth should have the same view as their elders, and really kind of stick to that. And it didn't sit entirely right, recognizing how many young people were there trying to engage with a policy that was so high level and so bureaucratic, recognizing that they had no voice. I knew then that I had to try to have an impact even at that high level, and even just getting young people a seat at the table, because what we were ultimately talking about was not just equity from a global south to global north perspective, but intergenerational equity. And that kind of started me down a track of ultimately creating, experiencing what it's like to create change in the real world by launching a network, a young person's network, that then collaborated with youth climate organizations from different parts of the world. And ultimately, many years later, or maybe only 4 years later, I can't remember the timeline, getting the UNFCCC to recognize an official seat for young people in a category they call Youngo. And you see that even today. And that didn't, in the throes of trying to make that change happen, we had no idea that that's where we would get. And I would say that was an early example that had fruits later on, down the line.
Artie or Erica, do you want to try to tackle that one?
Sure, I'll jump in, and maybe kind of like Karthikeya, I'll say that I don't think there was one moment where I said, okay, I'm actually a policy entrepreneur or any kind of entrepreneur with regard to the work that I'm doing in engineers and scientists acting locally. But I think a couple of years into the organization itself, it started to occur to me that maybe we were doing something a little bit different with engineers and scientists acting locally. And so the mission of engineers and scientists acting locally was really to solve a fairly acute problem. I had spent time in Washington and gotten there through a policy fellowship program that's designed to take people with PhDs in science and put them in the federal government. I eventually, after my policy fellowship and also working in government as a federal employee for a few years, moved back to California where I live now. Went back, I work in the tech sector, that's my day job, and but felt like I still wanted to be engaged in sort of decision making and got involved with my city government. And then I started to realize, well, city governments actually have a lot of sort of STEM-oriented issues that they're grappling with. They have far less resources than the federal government to hire people. And we should be spending more time helping people with backgrounds in STEM engaging with their local communities, because there's a lot of impact that we can have. And for those of us who maybe don't want to make a career change, we can do it while, sort of continuing to do the work as scientists and engineers that maybe, we were trained to do. And over time, I started to realize that wasn't just this is a way to fill a niche. If you have a science, if you have a career in science and engineering, but want to also engage in sort of decision making, I started to realize this is actually a responsibility that we should have as scientists and engineers. Especially, I work in AI and other advanced and emerging technologies, and there's just no way that government can make decisions without those of us who are actively working in the field being part of that decision-making process. The technology is evolving too quickly. And so I started to realize that going from, hey, there's just this gap in the way that the sort of larger scientific community thinks about engaging with policy, to saying, actually, maybe we need to be thinking about this very differently. And we need to be thinking about this from the perspective of what is it that is our responsibility within our community as scientists and engineers. And that then started to make me realize that it was kind of a different way of thinking about the purpose and mission of ESAL as an organization.
Now, how about you, Erica? Do you want to add anything?
Sure. I love these answers so far. And I think from my perspective, what I'll share is, I've spent my career at various different points along the science to policy continuum. And I think a lot about kind of the science policy boundary spanning enterprise as a whole. And I think there are roles along that continuum, some of which are much, much closer to science and scientists. Science communication sits in the continuum. Supporting scientists to engage in decision making is on that continuum. But when I think about policy entrepreneurship, it's in terms of the experience that I've had so far, it is the space along the continuum that is just so adjacent to policymaking without being in a policy role itself, that you can kind of slip between one and the other pretty seamlessly. And that there's this function in that direct policy adjacency where you can serve this role of being really, really, really helpful to decision makers in terms of making their lives easier in a way that enables them to do more. And from my personal experience, I had sort of the moment of like, I wonder if this is what policy entrepreneurship actually is in practice. I've been working in a nonprofit space outside of government, working to bring scientists into the conversation around the topic was on ecosystem services and federal decision making. There was a federal government, it was in 2013, 2014, immediately post Hurricane Sandy, and if this is a topic you've been following, it's continued for a lot of years since, and has now really made some strides. But in this immediate post Sandy era, there was a lot of interest in what does it mean to incorporate to really incorporate nature in decision making, and there was a lot that was unknown. There was a lot of need for the scientific expertise to be directly supplied to policymakers in a very, very short time frame, and from being in the role of helping scientists bring their science into a form that could be understood by decision makers in the White House, I had the opportunity to basically then go from there to serve a 6-month tour of service in the White House Council on Environmental Quality to actually help support that function from the inside. And I think that's where the policy entrepreneurship function really clicked for me, because it showed that okay, you can do this role, you can really be helpful inside of government, outside of government, and at a lot of different places along the continuum. But what seems singular about the policy entrepreneurship function is just how directly policy adjacent it ends up being.
So you can be a policy entrepreneur without being a policymaker. So that actually brings up an issue, Erica. You know, the essay that you wrote for Issues is basically a call to action. You say, listen, we need a better way of preparing scientists and engineers to be policy entrepreneurs, to influence policy. And basically you say, but you know, we don't really have a way of training people or preparing people in a practical way to do that at scale, to give everybody the tools they need to think about how they might behave as a policy entrepreneur. And Michael Mintram, you have done research that identifies a set of traits and a set of skills that policy entrepreneurs have. And I got to say, it's a pretty daunting list. You, for example, say that policy entrepreneurs typically are ambitious. They have tenacity, they have credibility, they have sociability. They need to be able to think strategically. They need to be able to negotiate, to network. And the list actually goes on from there. So Michael, I have a question that I want to ask you, which is, do you think policy entrepreneurs are born or can they be made? And if they can be made, how do we do this in a practical way? How do we move from the research you've done on what makes a successful policy entrepreneur to helping someone become a successful policy entrepreneur?
Thanks, David. It's a great question. And yeah, look, it's very easy to cast the role of the policy entrepreneur as someone who's kind of superhuman, who has all these different capabilities. I think central to the role actually is a kind of a desire to collaborate. And scientists are very good at collaboration. So that collaborative instinct is really critical to a lot of this. And then the capability of learning, which also is a good trait of scientists. So if you have a desire to collaborate with others and learn along the way, then I think you can actually see a lot of ways that experiences that you've had in the past, whether or not they're associated with policy making, can feed into the initiative that you're seeking to have. So yeah, in the work that I've done, I've been really impressed at the ways that policy entrepreneurs actually grow in the role, if you like. And I think both Erica and and Artie have sort of talked about, and Katakei also have talked about the way that they have sort of come to an understanding themselves of who they are and what they are doing in the policy space and the impact they can have. And so it's kind of an interesting thing that someone will start with a particular concern they might have. It could be a local concern. And they, in the process of that, come to realize they hear their voice. They see that when they talk about the interest or concern that they have, that others are listening and willing to, talk more about the challenge. And so there's this way that people come to an understanding that they can actually have a strong political voice. So there are instances I've seen of people who started off with a quite a narrow kind of interest and wouldn't even necessarily think of themselves as a politician, ending up being like a state senator. And I think that's because along the way they found. So to come back to your point, David, yes, it is the case that there's a lot of skill that's involved in policy entrepreneurship, but you don't need to have all of that at the start. And just on this, I think, just a couple of things. I mean, the thing about tenacity, I mean, I think we actually can become more tenacious. Anyone that's been on the tenure track, we kind of know that that there's a need to be tenacious in order to kind of get through that process. Credibility also is something that often comes through the work that you've done. So in science, the projects that you've been associated with, the positional power that you might have or position that you hold at a particular time can give you credibility. So all of those things I think are important for this. And yeah, I think they can be learned. There are some certain attributes that can be learned, and they can be learned on the job. And I think that's the most important thing, is learned in the job or in the project of pushing particular
So learn by
policy
doing.
designs. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Anyone else want to dive in on this one?
I'll just
I'll go ahead, Erica.
Oh, I'll add just one thing, which is I think there's a lot of it that can be learned, and I think as I've shared in the piece, like figuring out how to grow and empower a generation to really take this on. But I also think there's a spark of belief in one's own ability to be an agent of change that may be that I think it speaks, the whole enterprise, it speaks to someone like if you have that as sort of a core belief that there's a way that you can actually affect change in a positive way, the policy entrepreneur mantle just fits really well. And so I think it's like it's inherently optimistic in that way, and I think it helps. And the successes of like it's like, hey, like there actually something happened as a result of all this, moving and shaking behind the scenes. But sorry, Artie, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that this is a very complicated question, I would say, or maybe a very nuanced question. But, I think there's certain things that certainly can and should be taught. So one of the things we learned over time with engineers and scientists acting locally was that we kind of needed, we now have a section of our website called Civics 101. And we actually, I mean, though our audience includes a lot of scientists with PhDs, we found we still had to do a lot of basic education in civics about how government works. And so that's, something that I think often our sort of technical training doesn't always include. And, those sort of nuts and bolts, like this is a budget cycle or this is a legislative cycle. If you want to intersect it, you need to come in at this point because that's when most of the decisions are being made. I think that's, those are sort of nuts and bolts things. I think the other piece of it, and we're still kind of learning this as an organization, is that there's lots of ways to be a leader, right? And I know that because in my day job, I also work with a lot of startups, for example, and there's lots of ways to be a leader, and you may not have chief or, founder or whatever in your title, and you may still be, you may lead by example, or you may lead by being very good at building consensus or leading through influence. And so I think that's one of the things that, if you have passion for an outcome, and, I think this goes back to the believing that you can make a positive difference, but if you have passion for an outcome, you'll kind of find where you fit. And again, though, I think one of the things that can help is being able to sort of help people identify where they fit and identify maybe other like-minded people. Maybe they're not going to be the one to organize the trip to city council, but they'll be the one to amplify it or something like that. So I think that's the other piece of it, that we can maybe help people kind of move forward in whatever it is they want to do from a decision-making and policy perspective.
All right, okay, did you want to weigh in on the bundle of skills here?
Wow, you're you're singing my tune here. It's let me take a piece of what everybody has just said and introduce a couple of terms that I have come to learn in my more recent career. And one is this bit about having relentless optimism. That feeling that you can do anything. And, we, particularly in the climate space, we see that now. We have crossed 1.5 for a couple of days last year. It might happen again. We've been talking about trying to avoid these guardrails and how dismal the news is on the changing climate, yet pressing on, right? The fact that we still can do it or avoid the worst effects and really build resiliency in society. And so having that optimism, and it can come from an early experiment in something that worked. For me, that was driving across India in an electric vehicle at a time that India was one of, I think, maybe the only countries with commercially viable electric car manufacturer, pre-Tesla, in a country where 400 million people didn't have access to electricity, and demonstrating that a country at the front lines of the climate crisis was able to do this, and that we were able to build a national youth network on the backs of that. Once you experience something like that, you know that you can do anything. And then the other piece of that I want to introduce is radical collaboration, which is that we find ways to connect in incredible ways communities that would have never thought to come together, be it an electric car manufacturer and a youth movement prototyping their new lithium-ion batteries back in 2009 in India, to give 3 prototypes over to a gang of 12 young people who then decided to take us across the country to see if it would work, where there weren't even enough plug points, to, later on in life, subnational energy collaboration that I've had a hand in, between Utah and Rajasthan, 2 very unlikely places on the planet, just coming together to think about their shared energy challenge. So ways to stitch together communities through radical collaboration, I would say, another piece of that. And the last piece, which Erica really highlighted, is understanding and appreciating the unique role that individuals and institutions can play to contribute to systems change. And I know that we've gotten a question about whether or not policy entrepreneurs are systems change entrepreneurs. And I think that managing and navigating an ecosystem and thinking about everybody's role in that, everybody has something to contribute. Nobody is unimportant, I think is a mark of somebody who is a policy entrepreneur, to be able to make change happen.
Yeah, radical optimism. I like that.
Radical collaboration, relentless
radical collaboration. Yeah. We have about 10 minutes left in this moderated portion of the chat. So I invite the audience to throw your questions into the Q&A if you have them, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I want to turn to risk briefly. The word entrepreneur in the business world is often interpreted as somebody who takes tremendous risks, is at risk of losing it all, right? So my question, I guess I'll start with you, Artie, is, are there risks to becoming a policy entrepreneur?
So sorry, I was unmuting myself, but yeah, I think there are, and it probably depends a lot on where you sit. And so I think that, there's sort of the basic risk of not being successful, which is often the main risk that a business entrepreneur is taking on. And now it may have financial, right? There may be secondary considerations like financial considerations to that. So that's always a risk, is that you're not, if you're trying to influence a decision and you're not successful in doing so, and particularly if that decision is highly consequential, like climate change policy is highly consequential a decision. And so the risk is that you try and you work through these policy adjacent means, and you don't necessarily have the ability to sort of change the way that we're responding to this crisis. So I think that's one risk. I think, especially as we define policy entrepreneurs as people who might not actually be employed in the policy process, as policymakers, I think that there's at least another perceived risk that it will somehow, and I hear this a lot, it'll somehow harm your credibility as a scientist, and especially because there's a sort of view that somehow scientists are completely objective and we don't have opinions and we don't, and we just look at data. And so, I think that's one of the other, since it's so much at the heart of engineers and scientists acting locally that we want to help people engage in decision making without becoming policymakers, full-time policymakers themselves. I think that this is something that we, think about a lot, and that's where that sort of more kind of radical view of how I started to think about the role of scientists engaging with policy as being something that we really need to rethink who we are as scientists. One, we need to admit that we're also human beings who have inherent biases and have value systems. The scientific method gives us an ability to sort of put a check on, sort of our knee-jerk biases, but we still have values and we still have judgment that is not necessarily objective. And those are actually good things. They tend to actually lead to better science. And they also lead to scientists maybe choosing not to do things that could be harmful, for example. And so I think that, yes, there's a risk. There is a reputational risk, I think, depending on where you sit, to being a policy entrepreneur. But I would also say that there's a very significant risk to not engaging when you have information, when you have insights, when you have experiences and expertise that people making decisions that can affect, potentially millions or billions of people don't have. So I would balance it that way.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this question of risk?
I think I would.
There are a few things I'd say on this. That it can actually be quite helpful to be explicit about the risks early on and say, what if we try this and we fail and what we were hoping for, what are the benefits that we can take from this? And that I think is very important in terms of the points that were made about optimism. You want to maintain your own optimism about making change happen, but also critically the optimism of those who are supporting you in the process. So if you do something, maybe you're pushing for a policy change and you don't get that, but you actually have in the process drawn much more attention to the issue that you're interested in and passionate about. And if you've also brought supporters on board, then that in itself is a real success. And I think that's where, Artie, your point about sort of the risk of not acting becomes important. So I think it's really critical to think through the risks, but to also see that there are upsides here. And one last point on this is that there is absolutely an opportunity cost associated with doing work around policy which would take you away from from your day job, and that's something to bear in mind. And it might actually mean that there are certain points in your career where you want to do this, or you might say, well, I can do this part of it. Who do I collaborate with to get help in other parts of the entrepreneurial process? So I think there are ways to manage the risks and the opportunity costs. It's really important to be explicit about those at the outset.
Erica, do you want to add anything?
I would add 2 quick points. First, I would love to put a pin, Michael, in your last point on kind of the times in your career, because I think you're acknowledging the fact that this takes time and work, and we don't yet really have an infrastructure designed to support the people who want to be policy entrepreneurs. And so there are all sorts of risks associated with being able to take that time effectively. But I think that goes into more of the discussion of what it would actually take to build more of a movement at scale. To the other point I want to add is just to echo, Artie, your point about, it really depends where you sit, where the risks are. I think one of the antidotes to that is really leaning in on the trust and credibility, because I feel like there is a leap of faith that's happening on both sides. The scientist who stretches themselves to say like, hey, I actually think my science is relevant. I'm going to work really hard to get it into a form that you the policymaker can use and be useful. And then that risk extends to the policymaker as well to basically reach out and be like, hey, I'm going to be a champion internally for this thing that may be unpopular in my agency. It may take some legwork to figure out where it fits, but I believe that, you know, we don't have all the information from inside, and I can trust that the source of input and help is something that I want to run with. And so I think mitigating those risks is leaning in on the trust and credibility side quite a bit.
For my last question, I'm going to ask each of you, I'm going to issue a challenge. I'd like each of you to imagine that you have just a few moments with someone who's interested in becoming a policy entrepreneur. And you need to impart to them, and they want to know, how do I begin? Where do I start? What should I do first? Should I polish my message? Should I build up my Rolodex? Should I go raise a bunch of money? What would you tell them about the one thing that they could start with? Karatek, let's start with you. I'm sorry, Kartike.
Yeah, no, actually, yeah, that's fine. It is a
Apologies.
nickname. I would say identify the gap that you are trying to address, where somebody is either not addressing something first and thinking about the contribution that needs to be made. And I say that because I think the other hallmark that's kind of related from my perspective of what a policy entrepreneur is, and it relates to the collaboration piece, is you don't want to duplicate efforts. Nothing is worse than the redundancy of trying to recreate something, rebrand something. It bothers me. And so you want to figure out how you can uniquely contribute towards something, and then think about the coalition that you need, and the resources that you need, and that sort of networking, the network management, the network building is so key in this. And I would say so much of it is relational. You know, you cannot effectively turn a ship and you know, be a policy entrepreneur managing a network if you are not genuine in your relations with people. And I think that that's a secret sauce. And then with that, I think eventually, or not long after, if you're good at it, the resources and, you know, financial capital that you might need to do what you need are activated. So that would be my advice.
Artie, what would your answer be?
Well, I literally always start talks that I give for engineers and scientists acting locally with the quote that decisions are made by those who show up. So my first piece of advice is show up, right? Wherever it is, show up to a city council meeting, show up to a hearing, show up to a group that has expressed interest in a policy that you care about, even if it's their aims are different than the ones you want. That's often where you start to build knowledge about what's already happening. It can help you build knowledge about the processes, decision-making processes, those sort of the sort of intrinsic knowledge that isn't always written down anywhere. Who are the actual leaders in the community that are already influential and making change? But more than that, it's just showing up is the first sign to a decision maker that you care. I used to work on the Hill, and it's like, if somebody shows up every day or every week, then they're serious, right? It doesn't even matter what they're saying in some way. So I think that's the first piece of advice. And then the other is, I would just echo what Karthikeya said about this sort of, so much of this is relational. One of the things we talk about, especially at the local level, is that any kind of, we call it local and civic engagement. I don't call it policy engagement because a lot of times decisions aren't made through the government, but it's important that your engagement be relational, not transactional. It's not really about just like, okay, if I do this, what will you do for me? But really getting to know the community of people that you want to work with, that will be impacted, and building up those sort of real relationships and getting to know people and what they care about and what they value, because most likely there's some similarities and there's some differences.
How about you, Erica?
So I think I've heard a lot of the ones I would have picked as well, but I think I'll add one to the mix, which is know your levers of authority. So if you have a clear understanding of who has what authority to make what change, you can be very, very strategic and targeted in kind of how you approach the kind of entrepreneurship that you want to do. And so I think, to Michael's point, time is always at a premium. This is hard. This takes resources. There's nothing worse than trying to, basically shout your message to the person who has no ability to do anything with it. And so investing the time ahead of time to really understand the stakeholder landscape and the levers of influence for the change that you want to see happen. And I think in addition to that, being nimble, because I think it's important to understand that in any one of these outcomes you might pursue, there's many paths to a possible change. So being like tuned into, it may not be, the policy window might not be quite ripe for this audience at this time, but it doesn't mean that someone in a different agency or in a different part of the government might be asking that question right now. And so like the more you can understand about the levers of change and who's having what conversations when, the more I think nimble and strategic you can be with the ability to reach the right people at the right time with the information they need to make decisions.
Michael, before I come to you, I just want to say that, in a previous life, I used to work a lot with scientists who were trying to influence policy. And a key question that they often had not answered before they asked me to help them do something is, who are you asking to do what and when? And I think it's very important that you know the answer to that question before you figure out, who are you asking and what are you asking them and when do you want them to do it? Those are sort of three key pieces. But Michael, let's come to you. What would your one infinite piece of wisdom be?
Well, you ask about giving advice, and I guess one thing that I think is very useful is to actually ask people for advice, but think strategically about who would be a good person to ask. What I think is really significant is just to take that optimistic mindset and realize that people out there want to help you. They do generally want to help you, and there are people who have maybe close to your area. I mean, I think Eric, you used the word adjacent earlier, and it's like people who are adjacent to you and who have maybe been struggling to push a policy innovation through, and to say, look, could I sit down and talk with you, or could I take some time, or even if, and coming back to the networking point, Katakai's networking point, if you see someone at a function and you could say, look, could we catch up sometime? But they're actually just spending time with people and hearing their stories, I think is just so incredibly helpful and empowering. You can actually start seeing, wow, this is possibility. But I guess I've found just how the generosity that people have with regard to helping someone who wants to make change happen is just something that's really wonderful to behold. So that's what I would suggest. What advice? Ask for advice.
So a question from one of our audience members. They discussed that it's a challenge to know how or when to engage with a particular person on a particular issue. Researchers also are often encouraged to build relationships with policymakers or policy influencers before there are difficult decisions to be made. But how do you start doing that?
Well, that's where I would say the showing up matters a fair amount. A lot of the work I do nowadays is focused on kind of local decision making, and so it can be very easy to show up because I live 10 minutes from my city hall. So that's how I started showing up at city council meetings and things like that. But I will say, particularly if you're somewhere where you have a lot of elected representatives, anyone who has to stand up for election probably wants to hear from their constituents, and most likely they have informal mechanisms to get to know people. So I think that's one way, is to just start having those coffee shop chats and things like that. I think the other is that sometimes engagement starts in one place, and over time you build a relationship of trust that moves to other things. And so, I started off as an appointee to a task force by my city in one specific area around sort of beautification and dealing with waste disposal. But over time, I mean, I've served on other commissions, and I get asked to support all kinds of things, from how do we write a better survey to get food services out, because I have a background in AI and tech, and to, you know, housing issues, to energy issues, basically you name it now. City council members reach out to me because they just know me. And so I think that's where, again, it's a long-term relationship and trust building activity, but it can start by just starting with that first conversation.
I'm just going to jump to another question so we can get as many of these in as possible. The question is, let's say I have an idea, but it's based on someone else's research or some other body of research. Does that change the dynamic of my activity as a policy entrepreneur?
I would say not necessarily, but it would be incumbent on you to be a good collaborator and steward of that idea, right? I think my first, the first step would be like, hey, I was really reaching out to the person directly saying, I was really inspired by your idea. Would you be interested in collaborating to write it up in a policy memo? And if not, would you be willing for me to write it up and credit you? I think it's an important, I think a proper crediting is always important and nice, but I think it should and appropriate, but it shouldn't stop you from figuring out a path forward.
Yeah, I think Everett Rogers wrote about the diffusion of innovation and basically said that, an innovation doesn't have to be completely novel, it's just novel in a particular context. And so if we think in that way, I think it's very important for policy entrepreneurship that if you look around and see that someone else has actually worked up something that you would like to work with, yes, I think, Erica, reaching out to them and finding out how they did that and how could you apply it in this context becomes really important. That of course, speaks to the collaboration theme that we were talking about. But I just think it's if someone's already done the hard work to get the proof of concept, then that's actually amazingly good, to a great starting point.
Yeah.
Or as the songwriter, go ahead, Karthikeya.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, my instinct in that particular situation is, if somebody has a great idea, I want to find them a partner to project and amplify their idea, and really socialize it, with their consent, of course. But I'd be like, who could I, set you up with so we can really socialize this great idea? That's my instinct. That's how I would deal with that.
Reminds me of the old Tom Lehrer song, plagiarize, let no one else's work evade your eyes.
I just want to add one, I think these are a lot of important things have been said. I'll add one more thing, and this kind of goes back to sort of what is the role, and what does it mean to be a policy entrepreneur? And I think the best ideas I've ever had actually came from someone else. And so, and what it's really about is, I think, figuring out where you sit in the ecosystem and then what role you can play in terms of amplifying an idea. So, once serving on a commission, I ended up bringing up research in area completely unrelated to what I have any expertise in, but just something I happen to be familiar with out of personal interest, around sort of interventions around HIV, for example. And that had a big impact on a decision that my city made when I previously did work in government. I worked in the White House Budget Office. There was an idea that wasn't really related to my work at all, but something I felt that many of my colleagues needed to hear. So I actually invited the researcher to come present to my colleagues, and it changed some decisions one of my colleagues made moving forward with the budget. So some of it is recognizing that you may have, just by virtue of where you sit or virtue of the relationships you have, the ability to amplify someone else's idea and impact change quite directly.
Several of you have touched on this concept of tenacity, the idea that you shouldn't expect immediate results. You have to work at this over a long time and be prepared. We have a question that gets at this from a slightly different angle, which is, how do you communicate to your coalition partners or your collaborators or other folks that, policy does not move forward in leaps and bounds? It tends to leap forward in very tiny increments and takes time. How do you set those expectations?
So I would say two things is sometimes it does move forward in leaps and bounds, and you need to be ready for the windows in which it does. And so I think it's both a long and slow game of, I think RT, you mentioned this a bit earlier, of like there are parts of this that are really knowable. Like, that every year there's going to be agencies are going to develop their budgets. That every year Congress is going to go through the budget cycles. Every year there's going to be a State of the Union address. Like, so there are like waypoints in this cycle that are totally knowable and predictable, and you can work along that continuum to be an input into those processes along the way. And then sometimes you have policy windows that gave us things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, where because there was so much of the right material ready to go, that window happened, and policymakers were able to act on it. And so I think, really putting a little bit more nuance on the fact that, yes, sometimes policy change is super incremental, but sometimes it's not. And as a policy entrepreneur, if you're ready for the moments where all of a sudden it's not going to be incremental, and you've got the good ideas written up, the draft legislative text, whatever it is, then the policy entrepreneur and the people in government are going to be able to surge through and really deliver in it quite quickly.
Yeah, so I think Churchill is often said to have said, never waste a good crisis, right? As a young reporter, I remember a classic example of this that I witnessed was after the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill, massive oil spill. Folks popped up in Washington within days who had completely written pieces of legislation and completely written white papers on what needed to be done, because they'd been working on that issue for years. And the resulting legislation, which passed within a year of the spill, very rapid time frame, that's why we now have double-hulled oil tankers, and that's now why we have massive damage claims for oil spills after oil spills. So yeah, this whole idea of being prepared for the moment is important. Does anybody else want to add into that about the pace of change or the time scales in this activity?
Just one thing on that, David, and I think it's that this question you had about the possibility of losing coalition partners or supporters because you're not having the quick wins or the easy victories does seem to me to be an important thing to consider, and leads to the importance of sort of framing a narrative around what you're doing. I think that the really impressive sort of policy entrepreneurs in history have been people who have actually engaged in a kind of a baton passing, people who have said things like, I'm not going to see this result that you're going to see, but here's what we've done so far, let's move forward. So that kind of ability to sort of say, look, everything hasn't been lost, we've got these things here. And I think, your point there, David, about the Exxon Valdez catastrophe and how quickly people could turn things around is important, that there is this possibility of getting the work that you've done in the past to kind of pivot and have impact. But we've got to sort of be able to, again, kind of convey that sense of the work that's been done has not been wasted, and there are possibilities further down the track, but sort of keeping that narrative forefront and how to craft it, I think, is important.
So this is an interesting question, slightly counterintuitive. Is it necessary that policy entrepreneurs operate within the policy process model? Can they work outside of it?
Well, I can have a go at that. Sorry to dominate, but actually, I've just been looking recently at a case of a group of people who were working on developing a new approach to managing homelessness. And it's very clear from looking at what they did that they worked very hard at getting the proof of concept and also evaluating what they were doing. And that was partly in order to ensure that funders could see that what they were doing was worthwhile. But they did not strike me as being from the get-go saying we need to do a whole lot of political lobbying and various things that we would say would be associated with policy entrepreneurship. And what I think at some point they did, once they sort of said we've got things lined up here the way we want to move forward and we do want to make policy change, they then worked with people who had very, very good political knowledge and understanding of the system, and that was able to happen. So I think that that to me was a somewhat unusual case, but I think you can definitely have instances where people can be doing policy entrepreneurship work that's not embedded in the day-to-day of politics.
Anyone else?
And I guess one thing I'll add to that is that I've been using the word decision making quite deliberately, because a lot of things that affect your community, affect society, are not pieces of legislation at all, right? It can be the way organizations behave outside of that. So it could be industry norms, it could be social norms, it could be service providers in your community, so especially at the local level, that it could be how food banks operate, it could be how organizations that provide service to the unhoused operate, things like that. So I think actually there's a lot more you can do outside of the legislative and policy and regulatory process sometimes than within it. Sometimes that process is just providing a framework, but to really get the true change, you actually have to be working through other mechanisms as well.
Erica, I've got one for you. How do you build buy-in for radical collaboration? What are the key approaches to use?
Well, I think I have alluded to some of these. I think the element of the relational element, right? The being able to connect with people, understanding different approaches, different institutions, and the way they see change happening as part of a direction of travel. And then through the relational aspect, I would say helping sort of inspire them to think about their role in that change-making process, that unique role, is a way to stitch together a coalition for radical collaboration. So, for example, again, just going back to the example of a technology company that was testing out a new technology, and young people approaching it to say, hey, we're trying to build a youth movement on climate, give us these 3 prototype vehicles, and we'll just ride across the country in them, and we'll use it to build our movement. And by the way, it's going to help you figure out, road test your technology in real time for Indian road conditions. And it'll be great marketing too. And you'll get to sort of have a leadership role in demonstrating that you are able to really build this kind of technology. And I would say that along the way, using those vehicles to inspire different types of communities, be they business coalitions, mayor's offices, village self-help groups, to think about how and what they're contributing towards the ability of a country to address the climate crisis, no matter how little a role it played in actually causing it, or its own thinking that it can't address it or does not have the climate solutions, is a way to really inspire radical collaboration. I think there's an element of inspiring people about what they can activate. That's a key ingredient there.
Anyone else want to wade in with some radical ideas on radical collaboration? Interesting question. Are there any federal agencies that fund policy entrepreneurship? And I'll expand the question. Are there private sources of funding or training?
So I think, go ahead.
I was going to say, there's certainly some foundations that fund people. Usually they may have some ideological bent to them or some issue focus, but there's certainly some organizations that would fund people to really spend time focusing on their kind of policy work. I mentioned that I first engaged in policy through a fellowship that is a non-ideological fellowship that's really just designed to sort of fund people with backgrounds in STEM to go and spend a year or two in the federal government in the US. So there's certainly those types of work, those types of organizations. Now, I would say, I was funded to go be an kind of advisor in Congress, so that's not really policy adjacent. That's like right in the middle of policy. We provide training. Some other organizations provide training that's usually open and available, free of cost. But so those are a few sources of training. I think Erica probably has some more that she can speak to as well.
Erica, you want to throw anything in?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to add, I think, I think a lot of entities are thinking about this and even potentially funding it and aren't necessarily calling it policy entrepreneurship in this way, in the way we are in this dialogue. I'll just, shout out to my organization, the Federation of American Scientists. We've been, over the past 3 years, really pioneering like a methodology around policy entrepreneurship. So this from the belief that if we can support people to write down their ideas in a way that policymakers can really access, and then provide the scaffolding and resources to help them get in front of policymakers, that is a replicable engine of policy entrepreneurship. And so the entities that have invested in kind of this work kind of share the hypothesis that if we give people the skills and tools to do these things, to both learn how policymakers need to see information, but also to kind of understand how to do the demand sensing that I alluded to before, like this idea that a lot of these things are knowable, but a lot of the world doesn't really know how to read the policy tea leaves. There's a way to kind of invest in that ecosystem. I think we're seeing more and more thinking about it from the philanthropic standpoint. Just to address the government piece, I think whether or not government actors are funding policy entrepreneurship and calling it that, there are mechanisms for non-governmental and government entities to interact with each other in different capacities, and some of those involve funding relationships. And so thinking about how and where those mechanisms can come into play. And I will pass to Kartikeya, because it sounds like you've got something to add.
Yeah, I mean, just two very concrete examples. And I think one of you probably shares this with me in terms of bios. I mean, there's, in terms of, at least on the US side, because I think that question came in, and specifically government agencies, there's the Science Technology Policy Fellowships program, and that's through AAAS and ORISE, which I benefited from, which allowed me to understand how government makes policy from the inside through the US Department of Energy. And then there are private philanthropies. The one that I benefited from, which sadly doesn't make this grant anymore, but it was an incredible opportunity, and I think there are other foundations that do this, was the Compton Mentor Fellowship based out of the Bay Area, and that was through the Compton Foundation. And that basically, you had to apply, and it was basically right out of college, an opportunity, just like to cut you a check, to take what you learned in college and apply it to real world applications. And that's how I found myself in India, basically doing field work and then accidentally becoming a policy entrepreneur.
And we are coming to the end of our time. Michael, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, thanks, David. I think this has been a really incredibly rich conversation, and I've learned so much from the other panelists. So thank you.
The last thing I'll add, for younger folks out there, if you're in undergrad or just finishing your grad program, you might want to look at the NOUS Fellowship run through the Sea Grant program, or the Presidential Management Fellowship, both of which give you incredible entree into the federal establishment and can teach you a lot about at least how the federal government works. And with that, I will thank the panelists and turn it back over to Lisa.
Hello. That was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, David, Erica, Michael, Arti, and Kartikeya. That was, this was like this kind of wonderful issues conversation where, as people start talking, you come to realize that you're seeing something new, which is that scientists are sort of coming together, and there's sort of a moment of, in a sense, scientists and engineers, a sort of consciousness raising around the possibilities of being active and being that the individual can have a real role on really big systems. I think this was, I really did not expect to end up kind of excited by this and inspired by this conversation. I was generally excited by everyone who was here, but the actual thing that happened here was very interesting. And it sort of shows what happens when you have the relentless optimism and the radical collaboration and people with different perspectives coming together and talking about solving problems. So on that note, I'm going to say that if you would like this kind of conversation, although perhaps a different conversation, you've come to the right place. You can read more of our work at Issues in Science and Technology, issues.org. You can sign up for our newsletter to hear about other discussions. We have a podcast. We have many ways for you to engage and collaborate and find new people. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to the panelists. And thank you, David, for leading this great conversation. We'll see you the next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you are, from Prague to Africa to Australia to all the time zones of the US.